Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 137 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, and today's episode is on what is a psychopath and a sociopath, or something to that effect. I've not quite made up my mind about the title yet, but this is an absolutely brilliant episode. I loved it. Because, of course, psychopaths and sociopaths are really a common, well, no, they're not. I mean, they're really common in TV, movies, and even in our lectures because they're so, I wouldn't quite say strange, but because they really capture the imagination, they're really popular. So it's always really good to actually see what they actually are, but most importantly, what are they? Because tons of people don't actually know, and I'm no exception. I wasn't quite sure about the differences, but thankfully after today's brilliant podcast episode, I finally am. So you're going to love this. And it's Saturday, the 12th of March 2022 as I record this. Moving on to psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one, not quite happened to tie in with today's episode. So here it is. Here are the personality traits shared by famous psychopaths. What is psychopathy? For a concept that gets endless attention, there's surprisingly little agreement. Various models have been put forward over the years. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist for this has been particularly influential, but it too has been questioned, with debate centering on the nature of the fundamental traits that together can now make someone a psychopath. In a bit of clarity, Christina Sencro at Longwood University and Thomas A. Wigger at the University of Kentucky decided to look for shared traits in the 6 people, real and fictional, who have been identified as psychopaths. 6. Okay, sorry everyone, I was just a bit surprised that it's that few, but I guess because psychopathy is quite rare, it's a bit difficult to find participants. They present their work in a new paper in Personality Disorders, Theory, Research and Treatment. Their list includes a few names that might become as a surprise, but this turns out to be an advantage. The pair feel that it drew them closer to understanding which are the core traits of psychopathy and which are red herrings. Now, I won't really go on to too much about the article, but because of course that's the main focus of today's episode. But this is really important to actually look at it, because this research methodology is actually quite interesting, and because they also look at fictional people, which I particularly don't understand, because of course fiction is fiction. Yeah, but I know when I'm writing my own slightly mentally disturbed, or to be honest, villains are to be honest, you really cannot be that politically correct about my villains. Oh, right, but this is really interesting because I just clicked onto this, but the interesting fictional people, whether they actually clicked on, are James Bond and Sherlock Holmes, because this is what it says, that there are claims that James Bond is a psychopath. And even Sherlock Holmes is actually fearless and ruthless. So some people would think that he could be psychopathic, which is actually quite interesting though. But all in all, the entire point of this research article is actually to highlight the importance of actually doing research and actually getting a proper definition, because that's the problem. Because there are so many models, that include so many different traits, it's actually hard to pinpoint what is psychopathy exactly. So the next one is, having a sense of meaning is less important for your happiness if you're rich. Okay. Searching for meaning is something many of us experience through our lives. Finding something to strive for that gives shape, direction and purpose to things that we choose to do. For some, this meaning is religious, some political, some interpersonal, and having a sense of meaning can bring us happiness, or, if we lack meaning, unhappiness. A new study to be published in Emotion looks at the relationship between meaning and happiness in the context of financial resources. Rena Capello from the University of Toronto and colleagues finds that meaning is far weaker predictor of happiness for richer people than poorer people, suggesting economic resources that can impact how we experience meaning. And I guess this actually makes sense because, of course, if you have lots of money, then the problem is is that you cannot afford to do anything or have anything. And like because of that, the meaningful stuff and the things that you would get like pleasure from are actually harder to find that because they're not as special, because people can simply just do it. So interesting. And the last one is magical thinking and insurance. Taking out cover makes us believe that misfortune is less likely to occur. We're all prone to a bit of magical thinking now and then. Perhaps you would try not to step on a cracks in case it brings bad luck, or avoid talking about a good situation in case you've jinxed it. Yeah, I think I've been guilty of that a few times. Even though in reality, there's no way your actions could have any effect on the world. When it comes to decisions about finances and the risks, though, you'll probably claim to be a much more rational thinker. However, a new study in personality and social psychology bulletin, and I'm pretty sure that that's where the BPS gets most of its news, news headlines first, even though I can't blame them, finds that we're even susceptible to magical thinking when taking out insurance. The team finds that insurance against the loss or damage of a valued possession has what they call a talisman effect, making us feel that misfortune is actually less likely to occur in the first place. Well, we've all learned of a brand new effect today, so that's actually quite interesting, because I know from some of my own personal conversations that the problem with insurance is you don't want to take insurance out because, of course, I forget any examples off the top of my head, but you don't take insurance out for stuff that you would know won't get damaged. That, or at least you hope it doesn't get damaged. But the talisman effect, definitely interesting. Never heard of it before. So, I hope you've enjoyed the psychology news section. So now let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So I actually will try and keep this personal update rather short, because my laptop's been playing up all day. Yeah, for example, it took a whole hour to actually turn on. Yes, I'm not sure if it's dying, and if it is, I would rather get the psychology news section and the psychology content part of today's episode done. So I will actually try and keep this rather short. So the only interesting thing that I'll about this week is that yesterday I went, but I drove down to university. Yes, so that was quite fun. For a back to my university day as a part of my placement, just so the university staff could get to know us and how our placements were going, and that stuff like statistics for freshers and all of that. And in case there are any lecturers or other teaching professionals here, please do not do not give your students an hour-long video to something that is a in-person event. Please don't do that. It gets really dull really quick. So the reason why I actually want to talk about this is simply because if you're thinking about doing a psychology placement, please know that the university does support you, and there are actually quite a lot of really good social opportunities throughout the year. Just you can actually get to talk with our placement students. You get to talk about your research projects, your other coursework, and you can actually compare placements, which I actually found very, very validating because I also found some other people who were doing research placements, and their experience was the same as me. And to be honest, some of the people who had so-called proper placements, as in hospitals, I don't know if to be honest, but they basically had a lot more problems. Yeah, so that I'm really And as always, thank you for all of your comments, including one from this week from Alexandria Coco on Twitter, which she said, "I personally think psychologists are underrated and we need more of them. I teach in an adult education school in Italy, and we would benefit so much from having one in our staff and in schools in general." And I cannot agree more, Alexandria. Because now this is even going to become even more important, because we've had the pandemic, we've also got the concerning stuff in the news. And on the news, I was actually watching a Ukrainian developmental psychologist, who was actually helping to transport these refugees and these children who were their mental health was actually all over the place and actually very, very bad. And that one example alone shows why psychologists are so important, especially in schools and anything else to do with children. Because especially after the pandemic alone, their mental health is suffering, and we really need to try and help them. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment in the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by personality psychology and individual differences. And even though this is a podcast episode, it does actually touch on other areas of psychology, like forensic psychology, cognitive psychology, and social psychology. Yeah, but it really does cover so much. Personality psychology is the core basis here, though, because psychopathy and I don't know if sociopathy is a term though, but both of these conditions are actually personality traits. So personality psychology and individual differences. It's a really engaging, really great book that goes into so much great depth about personality psychology, because not only does it tell you about what personality psychology actually is, and also how we measure personality, it also goes on to the biological cognitive basis for personality, and it actually explains how our brain can actually form our personality before it goes on to the more applied topics. For example, political psychology and also religion psychology. So I really do recommend this great book though, because it will really help you understand what personality actually is. So I cannot recommend enough. And that is Personality Psychology and Individual Differences, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, or on local library if you request it. So let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. And this is just such a brilliant episode. Also, for psychologists, law enforcement professionals, and lay people use the term psychopath and sociopath interchangeably, with no idea what the differences are. So, but the entire point of today's episode is actually to discover not only what are the similarities, but also the differences. What are psychopaths and sociopaths? So before we go into depth about the differences, I want to mention the similarities before, since there are clear reasons why people mix them up and use them interchangeably. For example, both types of people, according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual version 5, I'm actually quite impressed I remember that, are categorized as antisocial personality disorders. These are types of personality disorders share a lot of common behavioural traits, hence the confusion, and the key traits that psychopaths and sociopaths have include a failure to feel guilt or remorse, a disregard for the rights of others, a disregard for social norms and laws, a tendency to display violence or aggressive behaviour. However, there are a lot of differences between these two types of personality disorders, and that's the real focus of today's episode. What are sociopaths? So, sociopaths tend to be nervous and easily irritated. They are volatile and prone to emotional outbursts. This includes fits of rage, which is what people normally think about. However, the first major difference between psychopaths and sociopaths is sociopaths are a lot less likely to become educated, and they tend to live on the fringes of society, as well as many sociopaths are unable to hold down jobs or stay in one place for a very long time. It is often difficult, but not technically impossible, for sociopaths to form attachments, and that's something that I was actually quite interested in, but I thought sociopaths couldn't hold attachments whatsoever, whereas psychopaths are pretty much the opposite on most of these points, but we'll look at them in a moment. Interestingly, there are many sociopaths that are able to form attachments to certain groups or people, despite sociopaths having no regard for society and its many rules in general. Therefore, these attachments will be very few to the sociopath and limited in scope. As a result, they tend to struggle with relationships. On the other hand, to other people, sociopaths generally appear to be erratic or disturbed people. And then if we dip into forensic psychology a bit more, with any crime they commit, including murder, sociopaths tend to be spontaneous or haphazard rather than planned. And personally, and of course, I am talking as a non-sociopath expert here, because of course, this is the first major episode that I've done on them. I think that this makes them even more scary. Since if I knew a sociopath, my concern would be, just to be talking to them normally, then they would be erratic and be outraged by something for no reason. That's to be honest, my mind cannot skip over the spontaneous murder part. Can you? Fine, because sociopaths are more erratic and arguably more expressive in their abnormal behaviour, it is easier for professionals and lay people to spot them than psychopaths, leading us on to arguably the darker and scarier of the two. They definitely are. What are psychopaths? Psychopaths are very different to sociopaths because psychopaths cannot form any emotional attachment, as well as that they tend to be aggressive and predatory in nature, and they view others as objects for their amusement. And I'm sorry, but that is just terrifying. Simply because that has to be one of the most chilling sentences I've ever said or written on the podcast. Anyway, to make this all even worse, just because they lack empathy doesn't mean they cannot function in the real world. In fact, they have often very disarming or even charming personalities, making it easy or easier for them to manipulate others and gain their trust. Also, psychopaths learn to mimic emotions, and despite them being unable to feel in the slightest, they still appear to be normal to unsuspecting people, leading them to be able to hold good jobs and become very well educated. To only add to this rather alarming type of personality is that some psychopaths are so good in their manipulations and mimicry, they are able to have families and other long-term relationships, so without those people ever suspecting they were psychotic. And the reason why I keep laughing and smiling is because if you think about this in the real world, then this does actually sound quite scary. You can actually think about the very dark applications of this. So personally, I think that this is what is fascinating, scary, and intimidating about psychopaths, is their ability to appear normal. Due to unlike sociopaths, you cannot tell just by looking at them. So you can just be talking to a so-called normal person, and they could easily be trying to manipulate you without you even realising it. And as I've mentioned on previous podcast episodes, including the one just after Christmas, I really hope that I never get to meet one. Psychopaths and forensic psychology. And as you all know, I never can resist forensic psychology when I have the chance. Therefore, in terms of psychopaths and criminal psychology, they carefully plan every detail of the crime in advance, and they very often have contingency plans in place, as well as that they seem unflappable in a crisis. Now, if that was the only major difference between normal people and psychopaths, then I would not have a problem with them whatsoever, because I do like organised people, but the other things are just too concerning. In addition, psychopathic criminals are calm, cool, and meticulous, as well as from a law enforcement perspective, the cold-blooded nature of psychopaths makes them very effective criminals. As a result, they are a lot harder to identify compared to sociopaths. And just to make things worse, it can be hard to know when a psychopath predator has targeted you. However, to start wrapping up this episode, it's actually been noted that thankfully psychopaths are rarer than sociopaths, and psychopaths are still considered the most dangerous antisocial personality disorder, as well as it is hardly surprising that nearly 50% of serial killers are psychopaths. Conclusion. So this really has been a very wide-ranging podcast episode, touching on topics from personality to personality psychology to forensic psychology and more. But I really hope that you've enjoyed it. Psychopathy is definitely a sort of a fun topic to explore because it is scary and something that I hope we never have to experience. I'll definitely be exploring it in future podcast episodes. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you got something out of it. If you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it. I'm really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And definitely please check out Personality Psychology and Individual Differences, available in all of the usual places. Well, that book really does help you to take your understanding of personality psychology a lot deeper. So that's available in all of the usual places. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.